Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready. What are we digging into today?
Well, it's a story that's been generating a lot of buzz,
Hmm.
about presidential clemency.
Yeah. Biden's recent decision to grant clemency to 1,500 convicted criminals.
Exactly. A lot of people are applauding the move, talking about second chances and all that.
But there's definitely some controversy brewing, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Especially with two specific cases that have people, well, pretty outraged.
Yeah, when you have a judge involved in a kids for cash scheme and a city official who basically orchestrated the biggest municipal fraud in U.S. history, people are going to have some strong opinions.
And they should. So let's break this down. First up, the Kids for Cash scandal. This is some seriously messed up stuff. We're talking about former Pennsylvania judge Michael Conahan.
Convicted back in 2011 for taking bribes, right? To send juveniles to for-profit detention centers.
Yep, and it didn't even matter if those kids were guilty or not.
It's just such a blatant abuse of power. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually had to throw out over 4,000 juvenile convictions because of his actions.
4,000, that's insane. And the victims were awarded $200 million in damages.
It really shows the massive scale of the injustice here. And beyond the numbers, there's the human cost. It's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely. One story that really hit me hard was that of Edward Kenzikoski. He was unjustly imprisoned because of Conahan's scheme, and he ended up, he died by suicide.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, it's awful. His mother spoke out about how shocked and hurt she was by Biden's decision. You can just feel the pain in her words. It really highlights how deep those wounds still run.
And what's interesting is the backlash against Conahan's clemency isn't just coming from one side. Even Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, a Democrat, criticized Biden for it.
So not just a partisan issue then.
Definitely not. All right, so we've got a corrupt judge profiting off vulnerable kids. Now let's switch gears a bit over to Illinois, where we've got, well, let's just say, a different flavor of corruption.
This one is all about money, right?
Yeah.
Like a whole lot of money.
You're talking about Rita Krondle, the former comptroller of Sixon, also got clemency.
Yep, the woman who pulled off the largest municipal fraud in U.S. history. $54 million, poof, gone.
Can you even imagine?
I can't even fathom that amount of money.
Yeah.
And the reaction in Dixon has been, well, understandably, not great.
Shock, disbelief, betrayal. I mean, their city manager, Danny Langloss, he said it felt like a punch to the gut. This is someone who's now free to just walk around in the community she betrayed.
It's wild. Both of these cases, it's almost like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Both Conahan and Krondle were actually released from prison early because of the pandemic, COVID-19.
Right, they were on house arrest. So Biden's clemency basically just ends that house arrest, makes them completely free.
So it's not like they were just plucked out of prison. But still, it brings up some big questions, like, could Biden's decision be tied to the Trump administration's policies during the pandemic?
Interesting point. Remember all those inmates released to home confinement to prevent the spread of the virus?
Yeah, it was a pretty chaotic time. All sorts of emergency measures being put in place.
Exactly. And Margaret Love, she's a former U.S. pardon attorney, and she argued that Biden might be trying to, I don't know, like clear the slate from that era, maybe to avoid even more controversy down the line.
So these two cases, they're bringing up some serious questions about clemency, justice, and, the ripple effects of decisions made during a crisis. It's a lot to think about.
Oh, for sure. And we're just scratching the surface here. But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? These cases force us to examine our own beliefs about what justice means. What does it mean to offer a second chance, especially when the crimes are this serious?
Big questions indeed, and that's exactly what we're going to keep digging into. Okay, so we were just talking about how those pandemic policies, might be connected to these clemency decisions.
Right, and a big part of that puzzle is the CARES Act.
Ah, yes, the CARES Act. Now, for anyone listening who might not be super familiar with all the legal stuff, can you give us a quick breakdown? What is the CARES Act, and why does it matter in this whole clemency thing?
Sure. So the CARES Act stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It was this huge piece of legislation passed in the early days of the pandemic. Basically, Congress was trying to, throw everything they could at the economic fallout. Stimulus checks, loans for small businesses, all sorts of stuff.
It was a big deal for sure.
Oh, yeah, a massive deal. And buried in all of that was a provision that gave the Justice Department the power to move certain inmates to home confinement.
To prevent the spread of COVID-19 in prisons, right?
Exactly. So that's how people like Conahan and Krondle ended up on house arrest in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does that connect to Biden granting them clemency?
Well, the argument is that Biden's actions are basically like a continuation of that CARES Act policy. By granting clemency to these people who are already on home confinement, he's essentially making it so they can't be sent back to prison.
So it's like the pandemic had these ripple effects that are still playing out in the justice system years later.
Precisely. And it brings up all these questions about, the long-term consequences of decisions made during a crisis. Like, think about it. The pandemic forced authorities to make choices they never would have imagined before. And now we're seeing how those choices are still shaping things.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to unpack. And while we're unpacking, we can't forget about the victims. I mean, we talked about the pain Edward Kenzikoski's mother is feeling, but there's so many others who were impacted by these crimes.
Absolutely. Their stories are so important in this whole conversation. The trauma they experience is real. And for a lot of them, Biden's clemency decisions feel like, well, a betrayal.
It raises the question, can true justice ever really be served in these cases?
It's a tough question, and this is where the whole debate gets really complicated. On the one hand, you have this very understandable desire for retribution, for the people who did these terrible things to be held accountable.
Right, like they need to pay for what they did.
But then on the other hand, you have this idea of rehabilitation, of second chances, which are also very important values.
So it's a balancing act. We want to hold people accountable for their actions, especially when they've caused so much harm, but we also believe in the possibility of change, of redemption. How do we reconcile those two things?
That's the big question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. But that's why these clemency grants are so thought-provoking. They force us to really think about our own beliefs about justice, about forgiveness, and about the whole purpose of punishment.
It's a conversation that goes way beyond just these two specific cases. It's about the role of the justice system in our society, about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. What do we, as a society, believe in?
You hit the nail on the head. And that's the key takeaway for everyone listening. These aren't just isolated incidents. They're part of a much larger conversation that we all need to be having.
Okay, so we've talked about the pandemic's impact, the victims, the idea of justice, and second chances. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at how the public is responding to Biden's decision. We know there's been some criticism from both sides of the aisle, but what are some of the other perspectives out there?
Well, the reactions have been all over the map, which is not surprising given how complex this issue is. Some people are arguing that Biden overstepped his authority, that this is a slap in the face to the victims. Others are saying that mercy and second chances are essential to a just society, regardless of what someone has done.
So lots of different opinions, and it sounds like those opinions are often tied to people's values, to their beliefs about the role of government.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that this debate isn't neatly divided along party lines. You've got Democrats criticizing Biden and Republicans talking about the importance of second chances. It's a good reminder that these issues go beyond just traditional politics.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. We're not here to take sides or push any particular agenda. We want to explore the nuances, the complexities, and encourage everyone listening to think critically and form their own informed opinions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive, giving you the information and insights you need to navigate this crazy world.
Well said. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into the legal and ethical arguments around clemency and see what these cases might mean for the future of criminal justice reform in America. Stick with us. There's a lot more to uncover. Welcome back. So before we took that little detour, we were discussing the public's reaction to these clemency cases. It's been, well, a pretty mixed bag, but now let's shift gears and get into some of the legal and ethical arguments that are swirling around this whole thing.
Yeah, the concept of clemency itself can be kind of a tricky one for people to wrap their heads around.
It is. It is. So for those of us who haven't spent years in law school, can you break it down for us? What does clemency actually mean in practice? And how does it differ from a pardon, for example?
Sure thing. So clemency is basically an umbrella term. It covers both pardons and commutations. A pardon is like hitting the reset button. The conviction just disappears, poof, as if the crime never happened.
Oh, I see. A clean slate.
Exactly. But a commutation is different. The conviction stays on the record, but the sentence is reduced. So in the cases we're talking about with Conahan and Krondle, Biden granted commutations. They're still technically convicted criminals, but their sentences are over. Done.
So not a total do-over, but it significantly changes their punishment. What are some of the reasons a president might grant clemency? I mean, what are the factors they consider?
Well, sometimes it's about rehabilitation. The person has shown genuine remorse, they've really worked to turn their life around. Or maybe societal values have shifted. Like, say someone was convicted of a drug offense years ago, but now the laws are much more lenient.
That makes sense. It gives the system some flexibility to adapt to changing times. But I imagine there's some pretty strong arguments against using clemency too often, right?
Oh, absolutely. Critics often say that it can undermine the rule of law, create this feeling that justice isn't being applied fairly, especially when it involves high-profile people.
And that seems to be at the core of the issue here, right? A lot of people feel that given the severity of the crimes and the harm caused, Conahan and Crundwell just haven't really earned a second chance.
It's a valid concern, for sure. And this is where the debate gets really philosophical. It forces us to grapple with the fundamental question, what is the purpose of punishment? Is it simply about retribution, an eye for an eye, or should it also encompass rehabilitation, the possibility of redemption?
Those are big, deep questions. And I don't think there's a simple answer, but it's clear that these cases have sparked a crucial conversation about justice, about mercy, about accountability in our society.
You're spot on. And they highlight the need for more open, honest discussions about how we use clemency. Should there be stricter guidelines? Should the process be more transparent? These are all questions we as a society need to wrestle with.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to think about?
Well, I'd encourage everyone to reflect on what justice really means to them. Can forgiveness and accountability truly coexist? What role should clemency play as we work towards a more just and equitable society?
Powerful questions. We hope this deep dive has given you all some food for thought, maybe even sparked some questions of your own. Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration. Remember, informed citizens are the bedrock of a healthy democracy, and your voice matters in this conversation. So until next time, keep seeking knowledge, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.